You probably think you know the creation story from the book of Genesis. I mean, it's one of the most famous stories in the entire world. But what if I told you that the story you know isn't really one story at all, but two ancient narratives cleverly woven together? Well, modern scholarship has uncovered this fascinating literary puzzle, and it's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, it all kicks off with these words that everyone knows. It's this grand cosmic opening that sets the stage for that iconic 7 day creation week. It feels so singular, so complete. But is it?
Because here's where it gets really interesting. When you actually sit down and read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 back to back, you start to see these really striking differences. And they're not just small details. They're so significant that scholars are now pretty much convinced we're looking at two totally separate creation accounts that were later stitched together.
Okay, so check this out. The biggest, most glaring contradiction between the two is the actual order of creation. In Genesis 1, you get plants first, then the animals, and finally man and woman are created together at the very end. But then you jump to Genesis 2, and the whole thing is flipped on its head. First, man is created. Then God plants the Garden of Eden. Then come the animals. And only at the very end is woman formed from the man. It's a completely different sequence.
So, what is going on here? For centuries, people just kind of explained these differences away or tried to harmonize them. But modern biblical critics look at this and they don't see a mistake. They see clues. They see evidence of a composite text, a masterpiece of ancient editing that brings together different, much older source materials.
And this leads us to the key theory that helps us make sense of all this: the documentary hypothesis. Basically, it says that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, weren't written by just one person. Instead, they're a blend of at least 4 major, distinct sources. And for the creation story, we're going to zero in on the 2 main ones. All right, so let's pull back the curtain and meet the 2 main authors, or sources, behind the creation narrative. Scholars have given them names based on their unique styles and what they cared about. We have the priestly source and the Jahwist source. And right away, you can see these two have completely different vibes. The priestly source, which scholars just call P, is the later one, written around the 6th century BC. It uses the more generic name for God, Elohim, and its style is super formal and structured. Then you have the Jahwist source, or J. It's way older, maybe from the 10th or 9th century BC. It uses God's personal name, Yahweh, and its style is much more earthy, almost like a folktale. So that first chapter of Genesis, the one with the 7 days, that's all from the priestly source. This is the big, blockbuster cosmic account. God is this transcendent, all-powerful being who creates everything just by speaking it into existence. Let there be light. The whole thing is built around this very rigid 7-day week, and it's all about order, separation, and why the Sabbath is so important.
But then you get to the Jahwist source in Genesis 2, and it's like a totally different movie. It's a much more personal, human-centered story. Here, God isn't some distant cosmic force. He's way more hands-on, almost human-like, what scholars call anthropomorphic. He literally gets his hands dirty, forming man from the dust and breathing life into him. The focus isn't the whole universe, but a specific place, the Garden of Eden, and the relationships within it.
Okay, but where did these writers even get these ideas from? Well, they didn't just dream them up out of nowhere. The biblical writers were in a deep, ongoing conversation with the myths and traditions of their very powerful neighbors, especially in Mesopotamia. You have to remember, ancient Israel was kind of like a small house in a neighborhood of giant empires. It was surrounded by these major cultures that had their own epic creation stories. So when we read Genesis, we're not just reading a story in isolation. We're actually tuning in to one side of a huge, ancient debate about what God, humanity, and the universe are all about. Let's take a famous example, the Babylonian creation myth called the Enuma Elish. Just like Genesis 1, it starts with a dark, watery chaos. And in both stories, the act of creation is all about bringing order out of that chaos. But the how is where things get wild. The Enuma Elish is this epic, violent battle between a whole bunch of gods to create the world. But Genesis, it's just one all-powerful God peacefully speaking things into existence. No fight, no drama.
So you see, the Genesis account isn't just copying these other myths, it's arguing with them. It's taking these common, familiar ideas from the ancient world and completely turning them on their head. By stripping out all the violence and the pantheon of gods, the authors are making a powerful statement about their God, one, sovereign, and unopposed.
Now, to really get inside the story, we have to do something else. We have to try and see the universe the way its original audience did. And let me tell you, their picture of the cosmos was very, very different from ours. So, for the ancient Israelites, the universe was basically a three-tiered structure. Picture this. At the center, you've got a flat, disc-shaped Earth, and it's floating between two massive bodies of water, the waters above and the waters below. Above the Earth was a solid dome, the sky, and underneath everything was Sheol, the underworld. And the real key to this whole picture is this thing called the firmament. The Hebrew word for it is rakia, and this is cool. It comes from a verb that means to hammer or beat out metal, like a blacksmith. They literally thought the sky was a solid dome holding back a giant celestial ocean. And this dome had little windows in it that God could open to let the rain fall through. That's the sky they pictured being created on day 2.
So this all brings us back to the big question, right? Why on earth would you take two different, even contradictory stories and stick them right next to each other at the very start of the Bible? Why would an editor do that on purpose?
Well, the leading theory is that it all comes down to a really specific, critical moment in Israel's history. After years of being in exile, the community desperately needed to unify. And what's the best way to do that? You create a single, foundational text that brings together the treasured stories of different groups.
This is known as the Persian Imperial Authorization Hypothesis. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. When the Persians let the Jewish people return to Jerusalem after the exile, they basically said, okay, you can have some self-rule, but you need to give us one official law book, one unified story for your people. This gave all the different factions, like the priests with their peace story and other groups with the older J story, a huge incentive to compromise and merge their traditions into one text that everyone could get behind.
So when you look at it this way, the Genesis creation story isn't just one simple narrative. It's this incredible tapestry woven from different threads of history, theology, and ancient science. And seeing all these layers doesn't make it less powerful. If anything, it shows us this deeper, more complex story about how people came together to define themselves and their God. And it leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. How does knowing where a story truly comes from change what it means for us today?